As I said at the beginning of the service, we're continuing our series called Shift, small changes that make a big difference in our lives as Christians. This is week 3 of a 5-week series. The first couple of weeks have really focused on what sounds so simple and, I guess it falls within the byline, which is small changes that can make a big difference. They may be small changes, but these are crucial for our lives as Christians. Just this idea that we focused on the first 2 weeks of being consistent in the Word. This isn't earth-shattering for us as Christians, but it's crucial. Week 1, we talked about being consistent in the Word publicly. So here, with our fellow Christians on Sunday mornings, making this a priority, making this a regular part of our week. The last week, week 2, we talked about being consistent in the Word privately. We talked about prayer and talking to God, but we don't just talk to God, we let Him talk to us. And He does that through His Word. It's this Word that serves as the foundation for our lives. It is the gospel that God used to bring us to faith. He continues to nourish us through that faith. And it's also the fuel for our lives, as Paul indicates in the Romans passage I read a few minutes ago. The Word fuels our lives, and it fuels the thing that we're talking about today, which is public ministry, personal ministry, which sometimes we think of as church work. The idea of work perhaps isn't the most one of those well-liked concepts. I mean, some people love their job, right? And when I hear about that, when someone says, I love what I do, I love my job, I love where I work, I love to hear that. I really do. Honestly, I'm excited for that person because, to be honest, you don't hear that a lot. You don't hear people say too often, I absolutely love what I do. So work has become one of those things, and this goes back to the Garden of Eden. After Adam and Eve sinned, the Lord told Adam, He said, work is going to be really difficult for you. It's not always going to be pleasurable and enjoyable. And so work continues to be that very thing. It is difficult. It's one of those things where, as human beings in this world, we're often just looking forward to the weekend. We can't wait till we get a couple days off from work, right? Or people are trying to figure out, how can I retire early? How can I stop working a little earlier in my life? There are cliches that have to do with work that really give us some insight as to where our culture is on this topic of work. There is, for example, the cliche or the saying that says, another day, another dollar. And the message that sends is that this is some sort of mundane obligation, this thing that I have to do week in, week out, day in, day out, over and over and over again. There's the saying, maybe at the end of a weekend, someone might say, well, back to the grind. That carries with it kind of a negative connotation too, right? This wearisome drudgery that I have to go back to on Monday morning, and I got to plow through yet another 5 days of this thing that just wears me down. There's another saying that is not exclusive to work, but it certainly has been applied to work, and that is that it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. This idea that work, or whatever the topic is, but in this case work, it can be relentless, and the competition that exists, sometimes it's unfair. And the unfortunate reality is that as Christians, sometimes that mindset that maybe you have towards work, for us as Christians, that can creep into this. It can creep into how we feel about quote-unquote church work, that it's an obligation for me to get involved, that it's kind of a necessary inconvenience that we got another event coming up, I got to, show up and do this or that. It's this thing that wears me out. Well, my hope and prayer for today is that we can work on making a shift in how we view church work or personal ministry. We have before us the lesson from Matthew chapter 14, the feeding of the 5,000. Just to give some context, because it really plays in nicely with our theme for today. The context is, Jesus' ministry was 3 years long, right? So this took place 2 years into His ministry, 1 year left, 1 year before Jesus would suffer and die for the sins of the world. This time in Jesus' life, this period of His ministry is known for Jesus withdrawing from the crowds more than he did during other times in his ministry. And that's what happened here. We're told that he withdrew to go off by himself to a solitary place. Jesus did this, it would seem, for a number of reasons, including the fact that, now he's getting down to less than a year before he would suffer and die. He was going to prepare himself for his suffering and death. It was also getting to be about a year before his physical presence would no longer be there with his disciples. So you'll notice in Scripture that he took more opportunities during this time, at least from what we're told in the Bible, seemingly took more opportunities to mentor his disciples, to prepare them for his suffering and death, and to prepare them also for public ministry. And so we're told here in our lesson that not only was that kind of the context of Jesus' ministry, but there's also there's an immediate context here too. We're told here, Matthew 14, verse 13, it says, when Jesus heard what had happened, referring back to the previous section where it talks about how John the Baptist was executed for basically doing what he was called to do. John the Baptist was the forerunner of the Messiah. He was the one who came to announce to the world that Jesus was coming, that the Messiah was coming. So he was an associate in ministry with Jesus. He was also the first cousin of Jesus. So this is someone close to Jesus. Mark's gospel tells us, by the way, this is the only miracle of all of Jesus' miracles that are recorded. This is the only one, apart from the resurrection itself, apart from Easter, that is recorded in all four gospels. So I'm just going to draw a little bit from the other gospels to help fill out the story. Mark chapter 6, verse 30 says, as to context, it says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. This refers back to a previous section also where Jesus had dispatched 72 of his followers, 72 disciples, to preach and teach and to share the gospel. And so now some were coming back and reporting back what they had experienced. So there's a lot to talk about, right? And for that reason, again, Jesus, we're told here in verse 13, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. I think we know what it's like when sometimes we just need to be alone. Sometimes we just have this strong urge to be with those closest to us for whatever reason. In this case, again, Jesus was dealing with a lot. We get together, we need that quiet time with those closest to us for mutual encouragement, for support, for whatever it may be. Jesus was taking one of those opportunities. Reading on in verse 13, so Jesus heard what had happened. He tried to withdraw, but then hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And John, in his gospel, tells us that they did this because they saw the signs that he had performed by healing the sick. So they were following him because he was a miracle worker. And I'll be honest, if I was sick, or if a loved one was sick, and there's this guy named Jesus who can heal the sick, I would be following him too, right? I mean, we can get it. We can understand. We get it why people were trying to seek him out. It's not ideal. It's not the reason why we as Christians follow Jesus, but we can understand their situation. And so I share all this context so that we can, I hope, appreciate better what Jesus did here. If you take all the different elements here, just add it all up, you've got Jesus lost someone close to him, his first cousin, an associate in ministry. We have Jesus reconnecting with some people that he had dispatched, proteges, and now he has this opportunity to debrief with them. We have the crowds not in it for the right reasons. So Jesus had some really good reasons to want to be alone, justifiable reasons. And he also had another reason to say, you know what, it's okay if we're off on our own because their hearts just aren't in the right place anyway. And yet, what did Jesus do? When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them. Literally, the original language here says that he was filled with tenderness. We have an expression in our English language that says the same thing. His heart went out to them. And Mark tells us that it was because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He saw them as lost, wandering first and foremost, primarily their souls on a spiritual level, And so he cared so much about them that Luke then tells us, even though there was good reasons for him to be alone, and he tried to be alone, yet his heart went out to him, and again, Luke to them, and Luke tells us that Jesus then welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God. Isn't it comforting to see how Jesus views people? Isn't it comforting to see how Jesus, despite the fact that he wanted to be alone, had so much care and concern and compassion for these people that he left that idea on the side and he ministered to these people who were right there in front of him. Today we're talking about personal ministry. And with regard to personal ministry or church work or serving others is another good way to put it, it's important for us to, in this context, it's important for us to consider how we view other people. If we're going to serve other people, we need to consider how we view people. And the reality is that sometimes, and I'm chief of sinners right here, the reality is that sometimes we view people as a burden. Sometimes we view people as a burden because they slow us down. When you're sitting in traffic, don't you wish like everyone else would go home so you can have all 6 lanes on the 405 to yourself? Get out of my way. These people are a burden to me, right? Right? Or lines at the grocery store or whatever store. I mean, we see people as holding us back, getting in the way. Sometimes, we see people as a burden because they bother us, right? Their personality traits, their demeanor, their idiosyncrasies, and as sinful human people, sometimes they don't sit well with us, and we really struggle with that. Sometimes, as human beings, we see people as a burden because they're high maintenance. And they drain us of our time, and more importantly, they drain us of our emotions, and they drain us of our energy. And sometimes we just want people to, I hate to say it, but it's true, isn't it? We sometimes just want people to go away. The disciples wanted the people to go away. We're told here in Matthew 14, verse 15, as evening approached, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." We remember a couple of other examples when the disciples did a similar thing, and this isn't to pile on to the disciples because we can relate, but there was that Canaanite woman who came to Jesus just bugging him persistently, "Help my daughter, help my daughter, help my daughter," right? And the disciples like, "Get rid of her, Jesus. How long are you going to let her bother us?" Or the babies. People were bringing their babies to Jesus, and the disciples were trying to shoo away the babies. What did Jesus do, though? We're told here, verse 16, Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." You need to change the way, Jesus is saying. You need to be part of the solution, and you need to change, in order to do so properly, you need to change the way you look at people. When it comes to personal ministry, when it comes to serving others, we need to change the way we look at people. And the best way to do that, the place to start, is to change the way we look at ourselves. There's a passage in Romans chapter 5, verse 8. While we were still sinners. So Jesus didn't see us and say, "You know what? They really like me a lot. They love me. They really need me. And so now I'm going to go do something about it." No, while we were still sinners, while at a time when we were lost in our sin and had no desire for a relationship with God, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You and I were a burden to God. A burden that required moving heaven and earth. A burden that required God taking the demotion of all demotions as he took on human flesh, as he left the glory, the perfection, the paradise of heaven to come and live in this corrupt world, where he was willing to suffer incredibly, and where he was willing to die an excruciating death. But I love this passage. Why did he do it, or how did he do it? What was his mindset? Where was his heart at? How did he feel? How did he view us? Hebrews 12 says that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Right? And when you look at yourself that way, when you see yourself in light of what God was willing to do for you, when you look at yourself in that light as one who was to die for, as one who was given the second chance of all second chances, as one who was given the promise of all promises, it really changes the way you look at yourself. It has to. I'm not just lucky, right? I'm not one who has found a way to make it on my own. I am immensely, you and I are incredibly, immensely, undeservedly blessed. It changes the way we look at ourselves. It changes the way we look at God, certainly, as the one who carried out this plan of salvation on our behalf, but it also changes the way we view others. Because we're all the same. We're all in the same boat. Others, whoever others may be for you, are no different. We're all just as needy. We're all just as undeserving. We are all just as loved by God. We are all to die for. So who am I to think that someone else is a burden? And who am I to think that other people are not worthy of my service? Reading on here, it says in verse 17, the disciples, so Jesus said, you give them something. The disciples say, well, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So they were assessing the situation. Can't see exactly where their hearts are at, but we know where their heads are at, right? I mean, logically, they're saying, look, there's gazillions of people here and just a tiny amount of fish. We have an impossible situation. But doesn't God sometimes put us into impossible situations to show us that He can do impossible things, and to teach us to rely on Him and to build up our faith in Him? The Bible is full of examples of this very point. Abraham did not have a child with his wife Sarah until he was 100 years old and she was 90. A humanly impossible situation. Young David, before he was king, he was the only guy in all of Israel who actually saw that God could work out an impossible situation when they were facing this giant named Goliath and his fellow Philistine soldiers. Gideon is another one. Gideon is one of the judges from Judges chapter 6 through 8. Gideon was called to serve as a leader of God's people into battle against the Midianites. And Gideon's like, wait a minute, that's not me. He objected. He said in Judges 6 verse 15, he said, pardon me, Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. I'm unworthy. My pedigree is nothing. I am unable. I'm ill-equipped. And mind you, in the end, the army that the Lord, under Gideon's leadership, led into battle was 300 people. 300 relatively untrained soldiers. I mean, you probably can't even call them soldiers. Individuals, right? Going against 300. Going against 135,000 Midianites. So Gideon says, I can't do that. Who am I? God says, I will be with you. He was with them. And they won. So we have here an impossible situation. Tiny amount of food, tons of people. Jesus says, Bring them here to me. Okay, this is what we have. Correct. Impossible situation. But with God, all things are possible. And so in verse 19 and 20, Jesus directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven. He gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. You know, there's a lot of lessons we can take from this miracle. You have Jesus' compassion. We talked about that. You have the fact that Jesus demonstrates himself to be true God. You have God's power. You have the fact that God provides. You have stewardship, right? They picked up the leftovers. They weren't going to be wasteful. But we're going to focus here, as we wrap it up, we're going to focus on the abundance that Jesus provided. He fed 5,000 plus. Some would estimate, okay, you got 5,000 men, add their families. Some estimate that to be around 10 or 15,000 people. Either way, even 5 is a lot for what they had. 5,000 plus people, everyone ate, everyone was satisfied, and there were leftovers. When it comes to personal ministry, you too have been uniquely and abundantly gifted. You'll notice here, it seems so natural and it's such a minor detail, but it plays in nicely here. Jesus gave to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the people, right? God gives to us gifts, and we use those to serve people, to give to other people in various ways. Peter makes that point. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8, it says, each of you, that's all inclusive, by the way. Everyone is gifted. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. We are all uniquely and abundantly gifted. And the reality is, I don't know about you, but I know about me that sometimes we tend to focus on what we don't have. We tend to focus on our weaknesses. We look at others and say, I wish I had what they have, instead of acknowledging what we do have. And instead of appreciating what we do have and utilizing what we do have. So just to use some examples, one of your gifts may not be leadership, for example, but you have compassion. Use that gift of compassion. Be compassionate to other people. You may not be very compassionate. You may want to work on that. But no, that may not be one of your stronger suits, right? But you have your physical health. And so you can serve in that way. You can use the life, the body, the energy, the stamina that you have to serve others, to be involved, to provide some sweat equity, so to speak. You may not have your physical health. You may not be at the top of your game at this point in your life. But you have financial wealth or financial gifts. Give generously. This may be a time in your life when financially things are really tight, but you are an amazing encourager. Be an encourager. Encourage the people around you, whatever your gifts may be. And they are more than just one, they are multiple. Paul writes in the Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, he says, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works which God prepared in advance for us to do. You were created to serve Him. You were created for personal ministry, to serve God and to be a blessing to others. So serve God and be a blessing to others. And I realize that this might require a shift in your thinking. This might require a shift in how you view your relationship with Christ. Don't ever forget that you were to die for. This might require a shift in how you view other people as blessings, not as burdens, as opportunities, not as obligations. This might require a shift in how you view yourself. Don't forget that you have been uniquely and abundantly gifted. All those gifts and all the opportunities come from God. Be faithful with those gifts. Be faithful with those opportunities. And let the Lord do the rest, even the impossible. Amen.